abstract, and I'm thinking, wow, that was a lot. So appreciate that introduction. So good afternoon to everyone who's joined, and I want to thank Amy and Sandy for inviting me to present at InChip this fall. And I wish that this could be in person so I could actually meet with people one-on-one, but it is what it is, and the pandemic is still going on, so we have to be safe and protect community health. So today I'm going to present my most recent findings on education in the Jim Crow South and racial inequities in cognitive functioning. And this is part of my broader research agenda that's investigating how state and local level variation in educational context shape cognitive health impairment and dementia among Black and white older adults. So before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge the Alzheimer's Association and the National Institute on Aging for supporting this work, as well as my co-authors, who include Jennifer Alshire, she's at the University of Southern California, and Mateo Farina, also at USC, and Stephanie Urena, who is my postdoc at the University of Maryland. And I'd also like to acknowledge the help that I had with all of the data extraction for this project, which was done by Christiana Johnson and Kelsey Cooper-Smith. So in the United States and globally, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias are of growing public health concern. Recent data indicates that 1 in 10 US adults age 65 or older have dementia, and that is around 6 million older adults. And by 2060, this number is projected to double to almost 14 million. National estimates also indicate stark and persistent racial disparities in Alzheimer's disease. So Black older adults report on average prevalence rates of Alzheimer's disease that are about 2 times higher than white older adults. And that occurs, as you can see, across the age spectrum. These disparities are also found when examining self-reported measures of global cognitive functioning, memory, and executive function. For example, using data from the Chicago Health and Aging Project, Wu and colleagues found Black-white disparities in cognitive health that were about 1/2 to 1 standard deviation in size. Similarly, recent national estimates document lower levels of global cognitive functioning among Black compared to white adults over 50 years of age. So this is a figure from the Lancet Commission, and you can see that in this figure, educational attainment is one of the most important protective factors against cognitive impairment and dementia. And almost 7% of dementia can be traced directly to differences in education. Though, as the figure shows, education also indirectly affects dementia via many of the more proximal factors that occur during midlife and later life. Researchers hypothesize that education is so strongly related to cognitive health because education changes brain structure via increasing the number of synapses or the extent of vascularization, thereby creating cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve allows individuals to more effectively cope with increased brain pathology, and that results in the delayed onset of clinical symptoms of cognitive impairment. Because Black older adults on average completed fewer years of schooling than their white counterparts, educational attainment is one of the most common explanations for why Black older adults report worse cognitive functioning and have higher rates of dementia than white older adults. For example, going back to that study from the Chicago Health and Aging Project, Wu and colleagues found that about 35% of that Black-white disparity in cognitive functioning was explained by education. These authors also found that the disparity was narrower at higher levels of education than at lower levels of education. And they estimated that about 17% of the disparity would be eliminated if everyone completed 12 years of schooling, but that about 58% of the disparity would be eliminated if everyone completed 16 years of school. So those estimates come from a community sample in Chicago that was comprised mostly of Black adults who were 65 years and older. In another study using national data on a slightly younger population, Diaz-Venegas found that education explained about 17% of the Black-white disparity in cognitive functioning among adults 50 and older. So even though education is a key determinant of cognitive health and dementia, a substantial amount of the Black-white disparity in cognitive health often remains after accounting for racial differences in educational attainment. This might be because researchers have focused almost exclusively on educational attainment as a measure of education, but attainment captures just one aspect of education, and that's quantity. It leaves other aspects, including school context and educational content, unexamined. And that's an important limitation because we know that educational context changed substantially during the 20th century. And during that short time frame, federal, state, and local funding for public education increased sixfold. The US Supreme Court declared that separate but equal schools was unconstitutional, and the US Congress passed a series of acts to provide additional funding to schools to revamp their science and math curricula and to educate poor children and children with special needs. So in a recent study that I conducted with my colleague, Jennifer Alshire, we explored whether these other aspects of education were related to trajectories of cognitive functioning independent of educational attainment. And to measure educational content, we used retrospective reports of whether the older adult had studied a foreign language in school or participated in creative arts during school, like dance, music, drama, choir. Or if they took or were enrolled in college preparatory courses during high school. And then to measure school context, we used respondents' reports of whether they ever attended a majority minority elementary school, or if their school was located in a rural versus an urban community. And you can see in the figure on the slide, and that provides an overview of what we found, actually. So the aqua line shows the difference from the mean trajectory of cognitive functioning for those who studied a foreign language or participated in creative arts. So you can see that doing either one of those things increased levels of cognitive functioning. And then the light purplish line shows the difference from the mean trajectory of cognitive functioning for those who attended a majority minority elementary school or a school that was located in a rural area. And you can see that results in lower levels of cognitive functioning over time. And then in the box above the figure, you can see the regression coefficients for educational attainment on level of cognitive functioning, just to give you a sense of the size of the relationship between these other aspects of education and educational attainment. And so what we found was that in models that adjusted for content and context and attainment, the size of the relationship between the size of the relationship was pretty much equivalent to the difference between those who had some college versus those who had a college education. So although we weren't trying to explain race disparities in cognitive functioning in this 2020 paper, our results did suggest that the context in which schooling takes place matters, because perhaps because school context shapes how much time a student is in school learning or what kind of instruction they receive, and those factors might develop cognitive reserve and protect people from dementia later in life. So nowhere are these differences in school context more evident than in the Jim Crow South. Before 1954, racially segregated schools were mandatory in all Southern states. This de jure segregation led to large race disparities in educational resources. There was also significant state variation in the allocation of educational resources to Black and white segregated schools during this period, particularly as it relates to school term length and how many days of instruction students received when they attended Black or white segregated schools. Importantly, almost 80% of Black older adults who attended school during this particular time period were educated in the US South. So traditional measures of education, like years of schooling completed, may not accurately measure the amount of time that students spent in school, where one could build cognitive reserve, especially among Black older adults who grew up in the South during Jim Crow. So the main aim of our study is to determine if accounting for state and racial variation in school attendance better explains Black-white disparities in cognitive health outcomes than using a measure of self-reported years of schooling among a representative sample of Black and white older adults who attended school in the Jim Crow South. So our first step to address this aim was to extract historical data on Black and white segregated schools in the 18th Southern and border states, which includes the District of Columbia, that were under Jim Crow as shown previously on our map of de jure school segregation. And this data was reported in the 1920 to 1954 biennial surveys of education of the United States, which was compiled by the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. We decided to exclude Missouri from our analysis because it's not part of the U.S. Census-defined Southern region, and very few health and retirement study participants who we linked to this data actually grew up in Missouri. So for this paper, we used two measures that were reported at the state level during this period: school term length in days and the average number of days attended by students. And both of those measures were reported separately for white versus Black segregated schools. And they only include data from primary and secondary public schools. So these two box plots show the school term length by state and census division from 1920 to 1954. So the length of the plot is kind of representative of kind of the years under investigation, the variation in time. You can see that there's significant state and time variation in school term length for both white and Black segregated schools, but that the variation is greater among Black segregated schools. So, for example, Black older adults who attended school in South Carolina during this time period would have a school term length that ranged from 80 days early in the period to 179 days towards the end of this period. Whereas Black students in Delaware experienced consistently longer school terms compared to other states, regardless of year. So although those box plots help us understand the state and time variation in school term length, they don't explicitly show how school term length is changing over time. So these line plots provide that information for one of the census division, the South Atlantic division, just to illustrate the general trend that school term lengths were shorter early in the period and lengthened over time. And by 1954, you can see that Southern states had school term lengths between 160 to 180 days for Black segregated schools, and between 170 to 180 days for white segregated schools. So to put this into context, the average school term length in the US today is 180 days. And so that's a length that was reached by many states in the South by the end of this particular period. So school term length captures how many days of school a student could at maximum attend in a given school year. However, not all students attend school for the full term. And this appears to be true for those students attending school between 1920 and 1954. The two box plots on this slide show significant variation in the average number of days attended for students in the South during this period, and that variation is larger for students attending Black segregated schools. Again, looking at South Carolina, we see that a Black student on average attended about 60 days of school in 1920, whereas a white student on average attended about 100 days if they were living in South Carolina, which corresponds to about 40% more time in school for white South Carolinian students than for Black South Carolinian students. Finally, these two box plots show the gap between the number of school days on average a student attended school in each state as compared to the number of days they could have attended school if they attended school in the southern state that had the longest school term length that year. And if you recall from the prior graph, a lot of the times that was Delaware or Maryland, for instance. So I show these separately for white and Black segregated schools, and unsurprisingly across the US South, Black students were in school fewer days on average than white students. And this gap was greater in some states like South Carolina. I know I feel like I'm picking on them, but it's true, as well as Mississippi, Louisiana, than say in Delaware and DC. So the next step in addressing our aims was to link the historical data to individual data, and the individual level data on Black and white adults come from the Health and Retirement Study, which is a nationally representative longitudinal study of U.S. adults over age 50. Since 1992, the HRS has conducted core interviews with age-eligible respondents and their spouses about every 2 years, with the most recent data available from 2016. And using a steady state design, the HRS sample is replenished with younger cohorts about every 6 years. So it is consistently representative of this particular population of adults over age 50. We linked our data using a single measure that was available in the Health and Retirement Study. So in their baseline interview, the respondents were asked the state where they lived when they were in school or around age 10. And after linking our data, we restricted our sample to Black and white respondents reported residing in the US South when they were school-aged, began primary school in or after 1919 to correspond with our biennial survey data, and completed their primary secondary schooling by 1954, which is when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and provided at least one observation on cognitive functioning from 1995 to 2016. And the reason we start there is because in 1992 and 1994, the measure of cognitive functioning changed. So this allows us to have a consistent measure of cognitive functioning over time. So our final analytic sample included 4,343 older adults, and that includes 2,950 white older adults and 1,393 Black older adults. And you can see also on the slide that we had about 26,000 person period observations. So per our restricted data agreement with the Health and Retirement Study, we can only describe where people in the HRS lived at the census division level. So that's what you see here in the map. And you can see that about 45% of our respondents lived in the South Atlantic division, and that corresponds to 43% of white adults and 53% of Black adults. And so this is where they lived, when they were children, so when they were in school. About a quarter of white and Black adults grew up in the East South Central division. That's the lightest color there. And then about 23% of Black older adults grew up in the West South Central division, which is kind of the intermediate bluish color on the map. And about a third of our sample had completed their schooling by 1939, another third by 1948, and then the final third by 1954. So the Health and Retirement Survey uses a modified version of the telephone instrument for cognitive status, also referred to as TICS, to assess cognitive functioning. And it's comprised of several kind of subscale tests. And so what we did was we constructed a total cognitive function score by summing scores across tests of memory and mental status. And that includes an immediate word recall test of 10 common nouns, a delayed recall test that occurred approximately 5 minutes later. So they were asked some different kinds of survey questions, and then 5 minutes later, they were asked to remember the 10 nouns that they were given earlier. A serial 7 subtraction test requiring respondents to subtract 7 from 100 5 times, and a backwards counting test that required respondents to count backwards as quickly as possible for 10 continuous numbers from the number 20. So you might be kind of thinking to yourself, how would I do on these tests? I always think about this when I'm working with this measure. Our scores ranged from 0 to 27. They were normally distributed. You can see the histogram there on the slide. And the aqua color bars represent the scores for the Black respondents or the distribution of the scores for the Black respondents, and the kind of lavender color is for the white respondents. So both are normally distributed, although you can see that there's a clear racial difference in terms of where that mean lies on those distributions. So as I mentioned, that total score is comprised of subscales, including memory and mental status. And it's possible that education is more strongly related to, say, memory versus mental status than overall cognitive functioning. So we wanted to look at these subscales as well. And so the episodic memory is comprised of that immediate word recall test as well as the delayed recall test. And again, you can see that on the slide, the histogram shows that it's a nice normal distribution, and that the Black older adults had slightly lower means on that distribution than the white older adults. And then finally, we have mental status, and that's comprised of that serial 7s and the backwards counting from the tick scale. And here the scores ranged from 0 to 7. They're somewhat clustered for white older adults towards the higher end of the distribution. You can see that in lavender on the slide, and slightly more evenly distributed for Black respondents, shown in aqua, although there seems to be kind of a little bit of a spike there around the score of 2. We used several measures of schooling to construct the education variables that we're going to use in our models. First, the respondents were asked how many years of schooling they had completed, and they reported that for values 0 to 17. And they were also asked the highest degree that they attained, and that included, a GED, a high school diploma, associate's degree, or a bachelor's degree or higher. So what we did was we top coded the years of schooling at 12 because the biennial surveys only included information from primary and secondary schools. And so that indicator reflects the self-reported years of schooling. And to account for the respondents who completed post-secondary school, so they received a degree, but were top coded at 12, our models also include respondents' highest degree attained. And then we looked to see what was the implication of top coding our years of schooling, and we re-estimated our models using the original variable, and those results were similar to what we're going to report in this presentation today. So using the biennial survey of education, the respondent's date of residence when they were in school, and the years that the respondent attended primary or secondary school, based on when they were born and the number of school years that they reported completing, we calculated the total number of days a white or Black respondent would have attended primary or secondary school if they attended school for the average number of days reported for white or Black segregated schools, respectively. So for example, if a white respondent was born in 1930 and reported completing 12 years of schooling, we used data on the number of school days the average student attended a white segregated school for the school years 1936 to 1948 from their state of residence during school. We then calculated the total maximum number of days a student could have attended school during their school years, had they attended for the entire school term length. And again, we used the longest school term length across all Southern schools in each year to construct that particular measure. Finally, we created a duration of school measure by multiplying the proportion of school term attended by self-reported years of schooling, as displayed on the formula on the slide. And here you can see that the distribution for this duration in school measure gets shifted. So when we use that measure, when we look at the measure for self-reported schooling, the white adults completed on average 10 and a half years of schooling using that top coded measure. But when we use the duration school measure, they report 7.9 years of schooling. And for Black adults, the self-reported measure, the average is 8.8 years of schooling, but this duration of school measure is about 5.8 years of schooling. So to answer our research question, we fit random intercept models that account for the non-independence of our observations and varying number of observations over time. We specified age as our time measure, and we centered it at the mean age, which was 73. We looked at different specifications of age and found that the linear age fit the model best, and that specifying age as a fixed effect rather than as a random effect helped with model convergence and provided the best fitting model. So we interacted age with all of the variables included in our models to assess whether those factors were associated with changes in cognitive functioning over time. And then we used the baseline sampling weights provided by HRS to account for selection into the sample and the complex survey design used by the HRS. But unweighted analysis yielded comparable results. So our first model included basic demographics and dummy variables for childhood state of residence. And then model 2 included the self-reported years of school measure and degree attainment, and model 3 replaced that self-reported years of school with the duration and school measure. So then we can compare the race coefficient from model 1 to model 2 to determine how much of the disparity is explained by that traditional measure of education. And then we compare the race coefficient from model 1 to model 3 to determine how much of that disparity is explained by the duration and school measure. So this figure plots the average adjusted predicted values of cognitive functioning across age for white and Black older adults. The white adults are in that purple line and the Black adults are in the kind of bluish line. And I show the difference in cognitive functioning between white and Black older adults at age 95, just for ease of presentation. But in this case, the size of the gap is pretty stable across age because there is no difference in the rate of decline by race. And here we see that the Black-white disparity at age 95 is 3.5 points on the cognitive functioning scale. So next we adjust for the years of schooling and degree attainment. And when we do that, the race disparity reduces to 2.3 points. So this traditional measure of education explains about 34% of the race disparity. And it's also important to note that adjustment for these measures of education almost entirely occurs because Black respondents' level of cognitive functioning is higher once we include education in the model. So as expected, part of the reason why Black older adults experience lower levels of cognitive functioning than white older adults is because of lower levels of education. So model 3 includes the duration in school variable that adjusts years of schooling by the number of days respondents likely attended school given their state, race, and when they were enrolled in school. And that disparity at age 95 now is 1.76 points. And so this duration in school measure explains about 49% of the race disparity. Okay, so now we're going to turn to episodic memory, and here we find that there's a slightly faster decline in episodic memory for Black older adults. For white older adults and then for Black older adults. So you can see the purple line is kind of declining at a faster rate. The slope is steeper. I've indicated the race disparity at age 95, again, for ease of presentation, but the disparity ranges from 2.5 points at age 55 to 1.4 points at age 95. When we include self-reported years of schooling, we see a reduction in the Black-white disparity. Education explains between 37 to 39% of that disparity, depending on where in the age range you're looking at. And then when we replace years of schooling with the duration of school measure, we find that duration of school explains more of that race disparity than years of schooling. It explains between 50 to 57% of that disparity using the duration and school measure. Our final outcome was the mental status trajectories, and here we see that Black older adults show a faster rate of decline in mental status than white older adults. And as a result, at age 55, the disparity is 1.5 points, and at age 95, it's 2.1 points. Okay, so when we adjust for years of schooling, it explains some of this disparity. The disparity is reduced to 1.4 points. It explains about 32 to 35% of that disparity. And then when we use that duration in school measure, we find that the gap is, again, further reduced to 1.2 points. And then it explains about 44 to 48% of the Black-white disparity depending on age. So this table summarizes how much of the Black-white disparity we were able to explain with inclusion of years of schooling versus duration in school across our 3 cognitive health outcomes. So generally, years of schooling explained about 1/3 of the disparity, whereas our duration in school measure explained about half. So consistent with prior research, we found that a traditional measure of education only explained about 1/3 of the disparity in level of cognitive health. And this seems to be due in part to the fact that traditional measures of education do not account for the severe racial inequities in the education system that were in place during the Jim Crow South, which resulted in Black students spending fewer days in the classroom being educated. Although education, either measured as years of schooling or duration of school, attenuated Black-white differences in level of cognitive functioning, episodic memory, and mental status, we found that only years of schooling was related to rate of decline in episodic memory. And that mirrors prior research that finds that education is more consistently related to level of cognitive outcomes and cognitive health, and less consistently related to decline in those outcomes. Part of the inconsistency might be due to the use of an imprecise measure of years of schooling that serves as a proxy for social and racial stratification, rather than or in addition to early educational experiences. Our measure the duration of school measure, it better aligns with the amount of instruction students likely received and may tap into those skills that build cognitive reserve early in life and preserve cognitive performance later in life. It also accounts for institutionalized racial inequity in the amount of instruction provided to Black and white students during the Jim Crow era, and in so doing, allows us to more accurately adjust for race differences in the amount of education folks completed. I want to note a few caveats. First, in order to create our duration and school measure from school attendance rates, we had to assume that a given respondent attended school for the average number of days that the state reported Black or white students attended schools. And that means that respondents who attended the entire school term length would have a downwardly adjusted measure of duration in school, whereas a student who missed a lot of school would have an upwardly adjusted measure. Second, we linked the state data to HRS via just a single measure that asked respondents what state they lived in most of the time they were in school, or around age 10. It's possible that respondents moved across state lines during primary or secondary school, but were unable to determine the extent to which that's the case. So to gain some insight into the amount of cross-state moves, I went back and I examined the percentage of the sample who moved states between birth and age 10, and found that 92% of our Black sample and 85% of our white sample lived in their state of birth at age 10. So these cross-state moves may be not as concerning as we might initially think. Finally, although the HRS collects information from proxy respondents about their loved ones' impairment and memory, which can be used then to create categorized measures of impairment and dementia, we can't incorporate that information into the summated scales of functioning. So our trajectories follow respondents until they're unable to complete that measure of cognitive functioning, and are therefore likely underestimating declines in cognitive functioning. Importantly, our results are likely cohort and context specific. Length of school attendance between Black and white students was reaching parity around the time of Brown v. Board of Education, and most states had similar school term lengths by that time. So disparities in quantity of schooling may be less important for cohorts who attended school after Jim Crow ended, whereas disparities in educational quality, context, and content may become more important for these younger cohorts. Our findings, however, highlight the importance of using historically informed measures of schooling when trying to understand the role of education in shaping the cognitive health of older adults. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, this project is part of a larger research agenda. In addition to looking at other cognitive outcomes, including transitions to impairment and dementia, I will also be looking at inequities in school resources as additional explanations for Black-white disparities in cognitive health among older cohorts. And then among the younger cohorts of Black and white older adults in the HRS, so those that went to school after 1954, I will be looking at whether the timing of state school desegregation and the extent to which there was state-level resistance to court-ordered school desegregation helps us understand race disparities and cognitive outcomes. To close, if anyone's interested in learning more about the data or collaborating on a future project that uses this data, please reach out to me. There could be possible ways to support such extensions of this work. So thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions. And
Thank you so
I don't know if I turn over
much.
the mic to the next person. So
I think what I'm going to ask everyone to do is if you pull up your participants bar on the right-hand side of your screen and hold your cursor over your name, you'll see that you have the ability to raise your hand. If you have a question, just go ahead and hit that little icon for me, and either Josh or I can unmute you to hand you the microphone, so to speak. Josh, feel free to jump in if that's not the way you want to handle it.
That's perfectly fine.
I know, now we're all scrolling to find where the little button is.
it looks like, is it Jean or Gina, or I'm sorry, I don't know.
It's Jean. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I was going to say thank you for a fascinating presentation. Just such a interesting use of historical data to explain health outcomes and health disparities today. I was wondering if you had any ability, I don't know if you can do this or not, like separating kind of elementary school versus secondary school, because I'm not recalling what happened to post high school, but did mention that because I think it's very interesting in terms of now where we're making sure the resources are going.
Yeah, unfortunately, the data tables that they provide in these historical documents are quite sparse. So we just have the number, like the school term length and days and the school attendance and days, and it's just for primary and secondary combined. They don't separate it out. So this is kind of good as I can get at the moment. I might have to. I feel like they might have some more of that detailed data at the county level, but then you're going state by state trying to find county level documents from departments of education. It's just a kind of a time consuming process, but could be something that I could try and get NIA to pay for. So, yeah. Oh, there's a hand up. Blair Johnson.
Hi there. I agree. It was a really neat talk. Neat to show how historical factors can play a role throughout lifespans like that. I wonder if maybe you're underestimating the linkage between amount of education for Blacks, given health disparities that Blacks face. So in other words, it would turn into sick days. Mm-hmm. And obviously you wouldn't have individual level data and something like this for sick days, but I wonder if those are recorded well enough on a state level or county level or whatever your unit of analysis is. You might actually identify an even bigger, more pernicious problem. And obviously it's part of the systemic racism that is part of a bigger picture, so there are probably other factors yet. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so you're saying that part of the reason why there might be lower, like why days attended might be smaller in Black segregated schools might be because of health issues, like childhood health differences between white and Black children?
Yeah, absolutely. Or seeking health care resulting in more sick days at home, and therefore you're out of the education. And I suppose you could talk about quality of education too, because this wasn't assured as well beforehand. So if you had a control for quality of education as well.
Yes. These are things that I'm thinking of as we speak. There's not that many measures by segregated school systems in these biennial surveys. It's basically term days attended, the teacher salary, not for the entire period though, which is unfortunate. I think they started in 1930 reporting that information. And then, the class size. So I could look at class size, but that's almost the only thing that I have to kind of get at quality. But I mean, your point about the sick days is, I think, important. I think also, I was thinking about that there could be differences in terms of where these kids were living. If you're a child that was on a farm and you were a laborer, so to speak, like with your family, helping them with the the harvest or so, I can imagine that there could be you're kept at home to help with some of those kind of things rather than go to school. So in addition to health, then I would think there might be differences too, even in terms of where they were living. But the data, unfortunately, the historical data is kind of not the best. But I think it's important to consider some of these other factors that might be going on simultaneously.
Thank you. I agree with everything you said.
Thanks.
I'll go ahead and ask my question, which was, you had mentioned about your future directions that one of the things that you were hoping to account for are indicators of state resistance to some of the changes that took place towards the end of the period of your study. And I wondered what data sources you were going to be able to draw from, or how you were thinking about capturing that data. I know that, we are currently living in an era of false narratives where, we're seeing documentation of non-factual things happen at a frightening rate. And I was wondering how you were kind of approaching those much older narratives that certainly had those same powerfully strong racial undercurrents driving them.
Yeah, so there is a sociologist at Brown University who put together a database of court orders and lawsuits against school districts after Brown. So it was in response to lack of movement on school desegregation. Parents or communities could bring lawsuits against the health education, or I guess it's not against Hugh. It was because they weren't following Hugh, right? The health education welfare is what it used to be called. And so he has compiled this information for every year from 1953 through 20 something. I mean, I don't need all of those later waves because these cohorts obviously weren't in school then. But so I was going to use that information to look at how many lawsuits were brought in a particular state in a particular year, and how that you can see when you just look descriptively how it changes over time, how there's more resistance in certain states, more lawsuits are being brought. So Alabama is a prime example. They had hundreds of lawsuits in Alabama. Places like Delaware had a lot fewer of those lawsuits. So that's one way that I was thinking about measuring resistance. Also, in terms of when they actually decided to desegregate the school, because just because Brown got decided in 1954, states did not automatically desegregate their school. And there's a report by the Southern Education, it's Sears, I can't remember, a reporting service, I think. So they had gone around and they compiled what percentage of the Black students in public schools are actually attending schools with white students. Now, that's a pretty crude measure because that meant that, Ruby Bridges, for instance, was in a desegregated school, even though she was the only Black child in that school, because she was there, even though they were teaching her in her own classroom. So it's not the best measure, but if you have fewer of the Black students in the state attending with white students, then that kind of also illustrates a bit more resistance than, let's say, a state that had 80% of its Black students attending schools with white students. So I have that data from 1954 through 1967. And then the census abstracts provided, because in 1967, Johnson passed one of the civil rights acts, included the data collection through the civil rights data collection. Some of you guys are education researchers, so you probably are familiar with this data collection effort to kind of monitor southern states and their racial discrimination in southern schools. So there's some reports similar to like what percentage of Black students were attending schools with white students in these census abstract tables. So I'm using that for the later years, so 1968 through 1978. So.
Thank you. There was a really wonderful NPR piece just a couple of days ago about how those same additional lawsuits had to be brought in the higher education space when states were told by the Supreme Court that they needed to provide equitable access.
Oh, interesting. So that was on NPR. I should check it out.
Yeah, in particular, the case study they cite is in Oklahoma, and the lawsuits that were brought in Oklahoma to provide, I think, might have been law school education. Pretty powerful narrative by the woman who brought that lawsuit about why she ultimately declined to attend the alternative that they provided because it was indeed for just herself, and it was literally in the hallway of the building. So interesting discourse about what did it mean to move to equitable access.
Yeah, and I mean, I think someone asked about higher ed, and I think that's important. For my grant, I was just focused on the primary and secondary school, but I think in part because of conceptually why I think education might matter for some of these cognitive outcomes in terms of brain formation and things like that, cognitive development. Although I know there's a bunch of psychologists on this talk, and so talking to them would have been great. I'm sure there's research about how brain development happens and at what ages and things like that. So I need to get into that literature more. But yeah, I am also interested in higher ed, and so some of those things, I'm sure that there's got to be some documentation out there, historical documents that I could pull from eventually down the road as well. I see another hand, but let's see. Emil Komen, is that how you pronounce the name?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I wanted to comment first on the excellent way of presenting something like this, which is pretty intricate in modeling. I'm going to borrow some of your ways of comparing models and what a new model is actually showing. But I have a question and a suggestion, so I'll contact you afterwards anyways. One of the slides actually did mention from a prior study that this kind of what some additional factor can explain in a health disparity or a gap in an outcome approach can be done using a mediator. In other words, one of these factors like education or years of education can conceptually be put into a model as a mediator, and those guys did it. So my question is back to you, whether you have tried to do that. In other words, to have race coming first, education second, and then some of these cognitive factors first, because the logic changes in terms of whether the gap itself is actually explained by an indirect effect versus by a co-predictor.
Yeah, that paper you're referencing was my paper. So yeah, we've done that work. It was a 2020 paper that we did. Yeah, and I mean, in that paper, we weren't looking at race disparities. We were looking, education attainment was our mediator. We were looking at how these early life factors on educational experiences were related to cognitive functioning, and whether educational attainment fully explained these relationships, and it didn't. And so for this paper, though, we were looking at race. So race went into our model first, and then educational attainment. So in that case, yes, it's trying to explain some of those race disparities. I think we can also, I think this is what Blair was asking too, in terms of other kind of quality measures that you can account for that might explain some of the educational attainment effects. We could do something like that as well, although the measures aren't the best. But it are definitely things that we're thinking about. This is our first paper from the project, so that we're only in the beginning of year 2, and we spent the first year just extracting all the historical data. So I'm really looking forward and excited to kind of dig into some of these other questions that that you mentioned, and in the future for future papers. So
we've come to the end of our time. I just want to, on behalf of InChip and everybody who came to hear the talk today. Again, thank you deeply for sharing your work with us, and wish everyone well as we move through this, third, fourth semester of slightly different academic presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.